Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we will focus on a new book by Loyola University's Elizabeth Tandy Shermer, Indentured Students, How Government-Guaranteed Loans Left Generations Drowning in College Debt. Congratulations, Ellie, on your new book. We're also very fortunate to have with us John Thelin of the University of Kentucky. John, a warm welcome to the Washington History Seminar. I'm Christian Osterman. I direct the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program, and it is my privilege to co-chair this seminar series with Eric Arneson of the National History Center and George Washington University. Today, Eric will introduce our speakers and moderate the discussion. The Washington History Seminar is a collaborative effort of two organizations, the National History Center of the American Historical Association and the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program. Over the past decade, more than that actually, the seminar has served as a nonpartisan forum to discuss important new historical findings, insights, and publications. Prior to this ever long-lasting pandemic, we met on a weekly basis at the Wilson Center. But we've been very pleased to come to you via Zoom and Facebook, though I hear Facebook is down today, for the past year and a half, and we're delighted that many more people have been able to participate in these sessions. Behind the scenes, there are two individuals who helped produce this event, Rachel Wheatley of the National History Center and Peter Bierstecker for the Woodrow Wilson Center. Thanks to both of them. We want to acknowledge our supporters, including GW's Department of History, and we, of course, welcome your support. The details about how to support the seminar are available in the chat right now, or simply go to our institutional websites. Next week, we will discuss a new book edited by Mark Bradley and Mary Dudziak, Making the Forever War, Marilyn Young and the Culture and Politics of American Militarism. Since it's a federal holiday, Columbus Day, Indigenous Peoples Day, that week, the Washington History Seminar will be hosted by the National History Center only. A quick technical explanation or instruction for the Q&A session. Today's session will be recorded and will soon appear on our respective organizations' websites. For the Q&A part of the seminar, you have a number of options of how you can participate in the discussion, and we hope you will. You can use, and that's our preference, the raise hand function in the Zoom functionality. You'll be queued, and then once we call on you, you'll press the button that will allow you to unmute yourself, and then you can pose your comment or question. You can also post your question or comment in the Q&A functionality. On my screen, it's at the top of the screen, but it may be elsewhere for you. And you could also email your question to Rachel Wheatley at rwheatley@historians.org. And with that, I'll turn the Zoom room over to Eric. Eric, all yours.
Thank you, Christian. It is my genuine pleasure to introduce Elizabeth Tandy Shermer today. She is a Loyola University Chicago Associate Professor of History who specializes in the history of capitalism, labor, politics, and policy. She finished her PhD at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She is, in my view, an incredibly creative and productive scholar whose books include Sunbelt Capitalism, Phoenix and the Transformation of American Politics, published in 2013, a 2012 co-edited collection with Nelson Lichtenstein, The Right and Labor, Politics, Ideology, and Imagination, an edited collection entitled Barry Goldwater and the Remaking of the American Political Landscape, and a book in progress, The Business of Education, 2 Centuries of Competing for Donations, Research Grants, State Earmarks, and Student Fees. Her many articles have appeared in the Journal of American History, Labor, Studies and Working Class History, the American Studies Journal, the Pacific Historical Review, New Labor Forum, and Dissent, among other outlets. Today, she'll be speaking on her new book, Indentured Students, How Government-Guaranteed Loans Left Generations Drowning in College Debt, published by the Belknap Press of Harvard University Press in August. Ellie, the screen is all yours.
Thank you so much. So first, I want to thank everyone involved in putting this session together and the many of you who have Zoomed in, but especially I need to thank Rachel Wheatley and of course, Eric Arneson. It means a lot to speak in person or virtually at a venue in my hometown. I grew up and was born in the DC area, especially since this book has a lot to say about the US politics and policies that have real relevance to past and contemporary discussions of public needs, public goods, and how to pay for them. So I'm going to lay my cards right on the table. I am one of the 45 million Americans paying off more than $1.7 trillion. And like many Americans, I once assumed that this student loan catastrophe was the unintended consequence of a program started with the best of intentions. And I was fooled by the guaranteed student loan program seemingly buried in the middle of the 65 Higher Education Act, usually credited with substantial direct federal investment in colleges and universities. But when I went digging in archives, I soon found that student loans were a way to avoid such a substantial federal investment. They were a part of a larger story of not investing in public goods for public needs, but instead leaving them to financial products, which in the past and now disproportionately leave citizens of color, especially women, drowning in debt. As such, although this book looks at the politics and policies that intentionally created a student loan industry, this story challenges a lot of arguments and assumptions about the American democratic experiment, especially in the celebrated decades of the mid-20th century. So the student loan story goes beyond arguments that there is a public and private character to US social welfare. It shows finance has actually been incredibly important to US social welfare long before the 1970s. The student loan story also emphasizes that those financial products oftentimes came with a government guarantee for bankers, an important consideration in the larger debate about whether the New Deal and its order did the most to boost the white working class or save capitalism. The student loan story also illuminates how politics and trends now associated with neoliberalism, one of the most poorly defined categories in academic and mainstream writing, has deep links to liberal policies and preferences. And the student loan story stresses that student loan policies came out of decades-old divides within and between parties that thwarted more meaningful investment in public welfare. So the partisanship, tribalism, and general beltway dysfunction that we've once again witnessed this past week about the debt ceiling and budget reconciliation goes back further than the 1990s, when many insist these issues arose. And I end on that larger point before I get to the story my book tells, because many expected this book to be a story of big bad bankers or corrupt for-profit colleges and universities, the usual villains and an important part of books on student debt. But bankers actually fought the creation of the guaranteed student loan program in '65, which lawmakers didn't allow for-profit colleges to participate in until the early 1970s. And even then, only with restrictions that had been fought over since the 1990s. Up until recently, a lot of policymakers in the US and around the world lauded the so-called US market-based approach for underwriting universities as a strategy that exponentially increased the opportunity to go to college at a rate much faster than any country in the industrialized West during that period. The argument was having public and private campuses compete for donations, government grants. Tuition paying students was remarkably successful. One historian daringly argued in the early 2000s that the guaranteed student loan program seemed a small price to pay, maybe for him. But lawmakers' insistence on indirectly channeling most funding for higher education through students looks far different after Congress mandated real data be collected on student loans from lenders, campuses, and states in 2008. 50 years after the passage of the National Defense Education Act, whose first title was a loan program for undergraduates. Lending that was once celebrated as a way to ensure individual opportunity, economic mobility, equal opportunities, and an overall improvement of social welfare has actually been a part of exacerbating racial, gender, and economic inequality in ways increasingly well covered in the mainstream media. But to understand the origins of the student debt crisis, the book challenges a lot of assumptions about the 20th century rise of mass higher education, starting with its growth and cost. There was a marked increase in applications during the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, which really increased after World War I, when just some college coursework seemed to guarantee white-collar work. Many campuses almost folded during the Great Depression when enrollments plummeted, and so the student loan story has a lot to say about the New Deal. There was not a New Deal for higher education. Leading academics didn't want one. New dealers didn't want to bail out, their words, colleges and universities. The matching loans and grants available to public campuses was actually more of a jobs program. That's how New Dealers saw it. And the work-study experiment offered to all nonprofit campuses reflected the emphasis New Dealers placed on managing the labor market and saving capitalism and other iconic programs for labor rights, banking, housing, and broad social security. So instead of seeing those as separate programs, we need to think about it as a holistic whole, as a window on the New Deal and its order. For the work-study program, the federal government paid students to work part-time, usually on campus, in order to have the money for tuition and living expenses. So the expectation that they would use the money that they earned to pay colleges for their tuition and to be able to live. Here was the intention of the program. Keep 16 to 25-year-olds off of relief rolls. Keep them out of competition for jobs. And I think this is so important about the importance of the labor market and managing it to New Dealers. Work studies really rolled out in 35. That is an iconic year for labor historians with the passage of the Wagner Act, the idea being that men would be able to bargain for that family wage. It's also the same year as the Social Security Act, which is encouraging older Americans out of the labor market with those public pensions. So it's a holistic whole that we're looking at here. Work study, also the point of it was to give young people skills to compete for a better job in the future, and also to prevent the kind of youth radicalism pervasive in Europe in the 1930s. There was a real fear of idle youth not learning the basic American principles to keep them from becoming communist, socialist, fascists. And it was also an indirect way to help campuses stay open, rewarding those institutions willing to admit impoverished students, and even more aid if they were willing to admit African-American students. What New Dealers never considered: giving students a loan. Student loans are inherently risky financial product. It requires no money down in order to pay for something that can't be repossessed. And your collateral is actually admission at an institution that needs your tuition revenue. So it's exactly that kind of risky speculation that the New Dealers are trying to vanquish in their banking legislation. And so work study, in a way, epitomized how limited 1930s social welfare programs were, as well as the lengths New Dealers went to preserving federalism. They left much of the work study program to campuses who decided who to award this tuition assistance to and what jobs they were going to do. Now, it proved wildly popular among young people, and it was only Director Aubrey Williams' open efforts to assist African-American students that's a key reason it would be dramatically ended during wartime political fights over the budget between liberals and conservatives in both parties. But work study mattered. It was a relatively short program, but it mattered because it cemented the importance of federal assistance coming through tuition assistance. The Roosevelt administration's approach to what many Americans still consider the country's most robust social welfare and education legislation, the 44 GI Bill of Rights. Popular memory has obscured how controversial that law, particularly the provisions for education, were. Many academics hated it. Robert Hutchins famously said it would turn campuses into hobo jungles. That's what he thought of the working class veterans, who of course would later be lauded as the country's greatest generation. Most politicians thought there wouldn't be any interest. And it was only passed because some of FDR's most outspoken critics wanted it: the American Legion and William Randolph Hearst. And it helped that the education benefits were sold in Congress as a way to avoid a crush of GIs applying jobs and possibly finding themselves out of work. The image of veterans once again selling apples on street corners. And again, you can see how important this federal tuition assistance, it was always bound up in managing the labor market. Political fights yielded some very devastating long-term consequences. The president and his staff had wanted the agency overseeing Social Security to administer the GI Bill on the hopes of someday expanding its benefits to all citizens, including the civilian war production workers ineligible for the GI Bill. The American Legion insisted the Veterans Administration oversee it, specifically to ensure only GIs benefited from a purposely temporary bill. And that was really the only reason that many conservatives in Congress, both Republicans and Democrats, voted for the GI Bill. But the Roosevelt administration was responsible for unintentionally exacerbating inequality through a law usually celebrated for giving working class veterans a hand up into the middle class. The program made college much more expensive as a degree became more important. The government paid tuition, but set maximum reimbursements higher than Harvard charged at the time. And the intention was to get campuses to raise tuition so they could pay for much needed expansions, both for veterans then and future generations. That doesn't actually work out well. It takes time to get the money in from tuition. And more importantly, it takes time to do the construction for an unexpected crush of veterans. So the GI Bill story is actually more incredible. It's a story of overcrowded classrooms, absolutely terrible living conditions, and colleges getting reimbursed for tuition in a timely manner, but soldiers not receiving quickly or sometimes at all their so-called subsistence checks, meant to keep it small in order to keep them from living high on the hog, being on a kind of educational dole. And what is then also part of it is the many soldiers unable to enroll because of their race, religion, sex, or physical abilities, much less the many who would drop out because those subsistence checks never arrived and they could not support themselves or honor their families without them, even those small checks. But the only reason it worked for 2.2 out of 11 million veterans was that they took advantage of the program, they demanded access and excelled in college, forcing educators, journalists, and the public to embrace the idea that mass higher ed was both feasible and necessary. But that still didn't mean that lawmakers and voters were willing to do much to make it affordable, and decades usually celebrated for state investment in higher ed. There were ambitious plans for educating more than half the citizenry that went nowhere in the late 1940s and 1950s, even as tuition continued to rise. Lawmakers continued to support bills in Congress that usually floundered over insistence that direct support for colleges only goes to those that were desegregated, were public, or had no religious affiliation. And there was also an effort by major philanthropies and businesses to stop the spread of public higher education throughout the 1950s. These business organizations and their philanthropies, they saw public higher education as somehow un-American. And you have to think about these, including Alfred Sloan, as a part of the larger conservative movement, particularly its businessmen really trying to mobilize already over what we would now call the New Deal order. But most states, with the notable exception of California, didn't devote all that much money to expanding public campuses, even though applications and tuition rates steadily increased. But what some states did was they started loan programs, and the states promised insured bankers' repayment if they would make a loan to undergraduates. And these state programs are starting around the same time that the Soviets launched Sputnik in '57, that small satellite that supposedly wrought an immediate sea change in federal support for education. At least that's what textbooks say. But lawmakers actually spent a year fighting over a bill that was temporary. It was a temporary piece of legislation. Talks stalled over integration, the separation of church and state, federalism, and the unconscionable idea that higher learning be subsidized so that students and parents didn't have to foot the bill. In fact, at the very last minute, lawmakers changed the financial assistance help for undergraduates from a scholarship, which is what graduate students got, to a complex loan program that offered undergraduates studying subjects for the nation's defense a low-interest 10-year loan. It's about $1,000. And the money for a campus's loan fund came from the government and individual schools' resources and the interest borrowers paid. JFK reminded Congress that this wildly popular loan program wasn't enough. Tuition actually went up 90% between 1950 and 1962. The average cost was about $1,800 a year in 1960, when the average family income was $5,600. And I bring that up because it's such an important reminder of what might seem cheap to us now, decades later, wasn't then for the majority of Americans. Kennedy insisted families shouldn't need to borrow so much, but his successor, and LBJ, put an emphasis on lending in the '65 Higher Education Act, a law usually celebrated for offering robust federal assistance for colleges and universities. And it looks that way on paper. The first three titles are direct aid for colleges and their libraries. Tuition assistance is the fourth, and buried in there is the loan program. But if you actually read LBJ's speech when he signed it, the emphasis was on tuition assistance, particularly the loan program. Likewise, many of those provisions, including the tuition assistance options, were implicitly intended to enable more students of color to enroll, a colorblind strategy that didn't really work because it didn't really have any federal teeth behind it. And policymakers and lawmakers were most openly proud of ensuring no student received an un-American free ride. The federal government gave schools money in order for staff to personally tailor a financial aid package of grants, work-study opportunities, it was revived in the 60s, and low-interest loans from private lenders, but brokered and insured by the federal government, just like the mortgage program from the 1930s. But behind closed doors and in budget allocations, the emphasis was on the loan program and working with top bankers who were initially reticent, if not openly hostile. They argued they made plenty of money through the state programs. That was enough to start some kind of student loan industry. And it really reflected their fear of more federal control and sort of resistance to the sort of spread of federal programs. And that might seem strange because the guaranteed student loan program, the guarantee in the title, that was for lenders, that they would be repaid for making loans to students. Not that students would get a loan, not that they would actually get a chance to enroll, or not that colleges and universities would actually get the students needed for them to stay open. And that guarantee, it's completely and purposely modeled off of the New Deal mortgage program to intentionally create a student loan sector to fund mass higher education expansion, just like the mortgage program was intended to create a mortgage industry in lieu of public housing. Now, bankers benefited whenever the law came up for reauthorization. The authorization that was most important in creating today's student loan crisis was the one in 72, usually celebrated for being progressive. It included Title IX, which was always more than about women's ability to participate in college student sports. Title IX doesn't guarantee that women will be able to pay for college. Also, 72 updates included liberal Rhode Island Senator Claiborne Pell's need-based grants, the ones now named after him, the Pell grants. And this is financial aid, small bit of financial aid coming directly from the government, which he considered another covert strategy to help students of color. It likely would have done more if it ever had been fully funded by the budget committee and not trimmed oftentimes, and more importantly, if it had actually kept pace with the rise in college costs. In retrospect, the most important amendments made in 72 was making for-profits with restrictions eligible for federal student assistance programs, and of course, the creation of Sallie Mae, a secondary market for student loan debt recently privatized, modeled off of Fannie Mae, which was so crucial to creating a mortgage industry. And you could see why that might seem like a good idea in the early 1970s. The mortgage program had seemed to make a country of renters into a nation of homeowners with a well-regulated mortgage industry. And that was the arguments made at the time. But of course, we have encountered so many arguments since about how the mortgage program contributed to racial and gender inequality. And in fact, there was broad up bipartisan agreement. The only person who raised any concerns about it was actually Claiborne Pell, as opposed to the massive fights over the Pell grants in Title IX. Sallie Mae encouraged more lenders to participate in the federal loan program and offer loans, private loans outside the federal loan program. And those private loans, their risk was not subsidized by the federal government. Sallie Mae's 72 creation occurred at the start of an era when steadily rising tuition rates really outpaced families' ability to afford those increases. Two reasons. Working and middle-class wages have stagnated during the 1970s and have never really recovered in decades renowned for increasing inequality. And there was a decline in government support for campuses. And that has continued after the 2010 Budget Reconciliation Act that more famously enacted Obamacare and also ended the original guaranteed student loan program and replaced it with a 1990s experiment in direct lending, which did nothing for those with debt through the original loan program or private offerings. I was lucky enough, I'll admit it right now, to enroll in a university offering direct loans in 1999 when I enrolled in UVA, but I had no idea. I was 17 when I signed that paperwork, no clue. But as personal as the story of student loans is for me and 45 million other Americans, I consider this industry's history symptomatic and revealing of the broader trajectory of the 20th century. The 20th century now seems defined by demands for individual opportunity and social welfare that exist on paper by the end of the century, when in practice there is inequality, lack of social mobility, and precarity not seen since the end of the 19th century. From a historian of labor or capitalism's perspective, that means thinking about the labor question, which hardly disappeared, but was fought out in other arenas than the shop floor, the picket line, or the bargaining table. It was also fought out in politics, in bureaucracies, and on campuses. And in many ways, it looks like the loan industry has helped create a new form of unfree labor that relies on a questionable proof of consent that makes abuses hard to police, and false assurances from policymakers, employers, bankers, and educators that more opportunities, choices, and freedoms will exist after a temporary state of indebtedness. In reality, young people don't really have a choice if they want to try and compete for well-paying jobs, which are increasingly becoming nice work only if you can get it. And even that nice work doesn't guarantee you're going to pay those loans off quickly. And I actually got the title Indentured Students from listening to how borrowers, young and old, describe their student loan programs and how they described it as keeping them from living the American dream. But I can't end this story without some hope. Thinking of Harvey Milk, you gotta give them hope. And I think the current pressure, starting with the Occupy movement a decade ago, from students, parents, and progressive Democrats is in many ways evocative of the 30s and 40s, when ordinary Americans were the ones who showed the promise and importance of higher learning, not just for the labor market, but for the citizenry. One can only hope that in an era of popular revolt across the political spectrum and around the world, that this targeted assault on such a regressive system might yield a much broader, more genuine expansion of opportunity, social democracy, and social welfare. In other words, a genuine investment in the people, the public, not a government guarantee for bankers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ellie. Before we get to our distinguished discussant today, I will remind those of you watching and participating that when we get to the question and answer session, you can use the raise hand function on Zoom. We'll unmute you, you unmute yourself, you can pose the question directly, or you can use the Q&A function on Zoom as well. You can start queuing up whenever you're ready. John Thelin is University Research Professor at the University of Kentucky's College of Education, Department of Educational Studies, Policy Studies, and Evaluation. His book, A History of American Higher Education, published by Johns Hopkins University Press, was recognized once by Forbes as one of the 10 best books of the year on higher education. He is, in addition, the author of numerous other books, including Going to College in the 60s, Johns Hopkins University Press, 2018, American Higher Education, Issues and Institutions, 2017, Philanthropy in American Higher Education, 2015, The Rising Costs of Higher Education, 2013, just to mention some. And I can't even begin with the articles because he would never get a chance to actually discuss Ellie Shermer's book. There are so many. And so with that, John, the Zoom room is all yours.
Thank you. As many of you have been sequestered over the last year and a half, I found that I've lost some of my conversational and social skills outside of Zoom. Well, I had a reimmersion into civil life last week at a reception, and but I felt a little awkward. So making small talk, and someone asked me, well, have you read any good books lately? Matter of fact, I had with me, because I don't leave home without it, was indeed Ellie Shermer's book. And so what started as a polite one-on-one conversation, the topic was so riveting. It was like E.F. Hutton. And there was this silence, and everybody in the room was listening and wanted to talk or learn about the indentured students and the crisis of student loan debt. So Professor Ellie, I thank you not only for a great book, but also for helping me re-engage conversational skills. John Kenneth Galbraith once said of his colleagues as economists, he said there are two groups of economists. He said, there are those who don't know, and there are those who don't know they don't know. Well, I don't know, but what about historians? And I'm candid enough to admit that I don't know. I certainly don't know the full story. And that is why I particularly appreciate Indentured Students and Ellie's work, because she has taken what is one of the riveting contemporary topics of our time for students, for alums, for parents, and she's gone back in Mr. Peabody's Wayback Machine, and it's also gone deeper. So it's an added multidimensional contribution to our knowledge and our discussion. And so I have some background in the topic, but nowhere approaching what she presents in her book. And I want to respond to some of her excellent introductory remarks with some observations and some questions. First of all, after discussing the GI Bill, which I enjoyed very much, what I recall about the GI Bill when it was promoted, not that I was there, was that the opportunity to go to college was one of about 10 options presented to GIs, and that the architects and advocates of the entire Servicemen's Readjustment Act were totally unexpected for the response to it. There were loan programs, startup businesses, real estate loans, and everything. So there was a strong element of surprise and at the response to it. Now, what I did not hear in that discussion of the post-World War II period was any mention of the 1947 Truman Commission report, probably because it was 7 volumes. And I'm sure that not many legislators, they probably stopped at volume 4. But I see that as a fascinating document because I regard it as kind of social science fiction. It was one of the most incredible portrayals of what might be in terms of, I think they actually used the term post-secondary education in terms of expanding opportunities. The problem, as I recall, is that it really was this wonderful vision. It was all dressed up with no place to go and never resulted in any funding. And so that, and I also regard the National Defense Education Act as really quite apart from the sustained, coherent efforts at building some kind of student financial aid system. So that it really, there is this interlude, even though American higher education undergoes great enrollment and growth, not only with the GI Bill, but then continuing after that, there really is, I think, more commitment at state levels. But for example, having grown up much of my life, well, actually, we moved from Boston to Los Angeles, and the difference is more than miles. The state policies toward higher education and affordability could not be more different. And so that whatever we see going on at the federal level that Ellie talks about, you do find in some states, notably California, but not only California, that, for example, the zero tuition policy, not only for the University of California, but the California state colleges, what were then called the junior colleges and whatever. So it may be that a major strand in the story is taking place outside Washington, D.C. and the federal programs, at least until, let's say, starting 1965. I also do not see the initial Higher Education Act as really substantive. It's not until the reauthorization of 1972 that student financial aid takes shape. And what I think is important to keep in mind is the federal government, at the time that it may have been haphazard or laggard in student financial aid, during the period from, let's say, 1948 and into the 60s, the federal government's primary role in higher education was through research and development. If you look at Vannevar Bush, and the National Science Foundation, and then the National Institutes of Health. So the commitment really was not focused on student access and student affordability. What I do think was the breakthrough that was important in 1972 was that most major college and university presidents and leaders and lobbyists were confident, and I think overconfident. They thought they were going to get direct institutional aid for any number of projects. It could be research, it could be for construction, it could be for libraries, for whatever. But there really was an interesting student lobbying initiative that I think helped turn the tide toward the appeal of portable student financial aid that could be used at a variety of institutions. It really changed the consumerism of choice. Now, what I don't recall, and here's where I am very dependent on Ellie's book, is that I did not sense that between 1965 and let's say 1972, that the banking industry showed much interest in proposed federal loan programs. And it seemed to me it was like at a junior high school dance, like being courted, or Scarlett O'Hara with the George Reeves of Superman and all the other, and Rand Brooks, all courting her and said, "Oh, will you? Oh, won't you?" And the bankers kept saying no, no, no. And Congress kept increasing the attractiveness of a possible federal loan program. So fast forward to the era that fascinates me is around 2005. And I recall all the enticements, like groups called My Rich Uncle, were offering all kinds of incredible loan enticements. And if you'll notice that almost every characterization of the student loan crisis today uses a comparison where it's linked to credit card debt. And I think the most recent figure is $1.7 trillion of student loan debt, and that's more than credit card debt. But what strikes me is that the real precursor or preview of the student loan crisis came about when you would go to college during freshman week, and the easiest thing to get was a credit card from any number of banks or whatever. And what I learned from some of my graduate students who were teaching undergraduates around 2001, 2002, it was not unusual for undergraduates to run up a debt of like $20,000 on these easy credit cards. So what I think happened in part was the psychology and collective behavior of easy credit cards somehow filtered over into the student loan apparatus. And I think that it is a way that marketing preys on consumers. And we say, well, these are young adults, they're responsible, but in fact, they're not. And whether it be for their easy credit cards or later for the guaranteed student loans, they are very, very susceptible, and knowingly so by those who are the adults who are the architects of this. The other thing that I want to mention that I was working with California's independent colleges and universities from around 1977 to 81. And the Middle Income Assistance Act of 1977 was the most bizarre episode in which banks just welcomed students to apply. And what you often had, to me, was upper middle class families who were taking out these loans and using it for like buying a boat, buying a beach house or whatever. And it was like the right idea used in completely the wrong direction. So to quote Laurel and Hardy, Ollie, what a great mess you've gotten us in. So I've raised some questions. I want to hear what Ellie and others have to say. So I'll be one of the historians who knows that he does not know. Thank you.
Ellie, thoughts and responses?
Yes, that would require me to unmute. You'd think after 2 years of Zoom, I would have gotten this down by now. So thank you so much, Professor Thelin, for putting that out. And one is actually, I'm really glad that you brought up the GI Bill of one of many options. And I think that's also true in the case of the Great Society and War on Poverty. And I think it's very powerful that by the time we get to the Great Recession, that actually there was so much emphasis, I didn't talk about it today, so much emphasis on expanding the Pell Grant program, that's a very powerful and important thing about how narrow it is. And Michelle Obama, even though on the campaign trail in 2008 talked about how she and Barack had only recently paid off their student debt, was out there trying to get every young American to fill out the FAFSA, just the narrowing of options to just student loans. And similarly, I'm really glad that you brought up the Zook Commission or the Zook report of 4748. One is that got cut out of the manuscript, but it is actually going to show up in a special issue of Change that I and others are doing for the 75th anniversary of this remarkable 5-volume report, which indeed even education, not everyone actually reads, but it's actually a very quick read. There's a lot of charts in that five volumes. So that's going to be coming out in Change in January to mark the 75th anniversary of it. But I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the other things that you raised. Research and development was absolutely an important part of the federal push, particularly before the 65 Higher Education Act. However, really, if you're in the congressional debates, if you're in the Johnson White House, they are focused on tuition assistance. And it is actually getting beyond that idea that there is, even though you have this last gasp of many possibilities for young people with both the War on Poverty and the Great Society programs, for programs like this, VISTA, things like that, that there is this emphasis on getting young people into school to expand that academy. And the pressure becomes less about controlling the labor market, but guaranteeing equal opportunities, with the assumption being that if we have equal opportunities to enroll in college, then that will do something about the rampant economic and racial inequality that go together. And I think the interesting thing about the banking industry is they absolutely were not interested at all. They fought it, and you did actually have to sweeten the pot. And that's one of the interesting things. MISA, the section on the MISA, the middle income. But I think that's actually, I'm glad you brought it up, because the whole point of offering MISA, which was to expand the ability to loan, to deal with the income limits on it at the time, was actually a way to avoid tax cuts, to avoid paying for higher education, for tax deductions and tax cuts. That was a very challenging negotiation between the Carter administration and Democrats and Republicans in Congress. And it has been a very big part of the fights over expanding higher education access, actually since the 50s, was we can do this through federal tax deductions and tax write-offs, which Eisenhower himself, when Barry Goldwater of Arizona kept pushing for it, says this is not going to do anything for it. And it is, to me, I think one of the great sadnesses that it was actually under Bill Clinton that the tax deductions that have now become sacrosanct, but still don't do anything to actually guarantee affordability, have become so important. And as your last question about how easy the credit became, I do think that this story is deeply intertwined with the expansion of consumer credit, but I also think the expansion of the need for consumer credit, the need for credit cards, is about a basic disinvestment in public welfare. So you would need to have that. And more importantly, about the stagnations of real wages for working and middle class people, so that you would have to borrow for basic needs and to actually keep up with that sort of standard of living. And I think that there's no surprise that credit cards would be something that many Americans have watched their parents rely on as a part of a culture, as a larger question about how much we have to borrow to maintain a sort of basic middle class existence, as with the challenges of what's actually happening with real wages since the 70s. And on that, I will welcome more questions.
All right. Thank you very much. I have a number, but I'm going to hold off because Steve Lipsum has had his hand up and has been patiently waiting. Steve, if you would unmute yourself, you can pose your question.
Hi, thank you. Very interesting talk. I guess one question I had concerned the role of student activism. I mean, we hear a lot about student activism in the 60s and like the free speech movement, the fight for ethnic studies and Black studies studies programs. How much is the So how much student activism was there and what kinds of student activism was there for college affordability in the 60s and early 70s, and what effect did that have on policymaking?
There wasn't. And quite simply, it's really actually very striking that the question about that is actually access to education, not necessarily the cost of it. And what was also very striking is that you don't actually have strikes and protests about the steadily rising cost of college, but there are other aspects on campus. It was also a hindrance. It led some Democrats, including key Democrats who had actually been pushing for expanding higher education, to actually step back from their support for higher education. And this is now, of course, she's a Democrat from Oregon. It'll come to me as soon as I stop answering this question. Edith Green, who was a major proponent and pushing for it. And all she could talk about in 72 was actually wanting to limit access, these fears of campus radicals that she's talking about. And I think the thing that was striking for me, it was not until the early 1990s that policymakers the lawmakers actually bothered to hear from students. And it's a dramatic sea change in those early 1990s when they had an entire forum for students to talk about the debt that they were under, which was absolutely shocking for lawmakers involved on the education committees. And for me, that was heartbreaking because I had been spending months and months and months going through their papers where these stories are there about how hard it was to afford an education, but it took those students crowding into a small room in Congress, bringing the walls down, when they actually just in actual shock. It's like, that the lawmakers expressed shocked that they had not realized how hard it was to afford a college education in the early 1990s. And I think that for me is so important. But at that point, I also need to credit the importance of the Occupy movement in terms of actually bringing these open discussions about the debts people are incurring, the challenge of actually having to pay it off, bringing it into the public sphere and doing so much to keep the energy going. And that's where students and parents have been so important in the last decade. It's been 10 years since Occupy, in really pushing the gun for reimagining how college is paid for, but also the big push right now for canceling student debt. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Susan, yes, John.
Just a brief response. If you look at American higher education around 1975, starting, which would be in the heart of what was called the higher education New Depression, there actually was a tapering of high school graduates. There also was, with the end of the Vietnam War, a decline in enrollments. And actually the situation was that colleges were worried as to whether they would be able to enroll an adequate number of students. It was what the portable student aid did was that it allowed admissions offices to become proactive and to work with their financial aid offices to actively go after students. And in some ways, this partially extended the diversity in that having a Pell Grant or whatever made a student as an applicant probably more attractive than they would have been some years earlier.
Thank you. Susan Levine has a hand up. Please unmute and pose your question.
Hello, it's actually Leon Fink speaking.
Welcome, Leon.
Yes. All right. Ellie, it's clearly an important study, and appreciate your the depth of research here. My question is in the general comparison that you draw between the private welfare state effectively created both in housing and in education, and then then how they both come to problematic ends. But in comparing the two, mortgage insurance and subsidy with educational loans, it seems to be a difference that the housing move the housing structure never created at least the political crisis that the education one seems to have created. Yes, you can point to all kind of racism within the structure of mortgages, but there's no demand now, mass demand for public housing, for example. And the variety of housing did seem to sprout through the federal subsidy program. Whereas in education, the cost of education has skyrocketed, and I'm wondering if that's related to the loan program itself. So could you help me disentangle or connect more intimately the problems of those two sectors?
Absolutely, I will. And the first thing I'll say is the cost of housing has exponentially increased since the 1935, the 1934 Federal Housing Act. And so that I think, and especially the importance of housing to this sort of basic wealth. And let me just just bear down on this a little bit more. And especially as we're wondering what the end of the eviction moratorium is going to bring in cities and states across the country right now, much less the memories of the 2008 housing crisis, right, with the Great Recession, is fundamentally the key link between the housing and the higher education is that the federal mortgage program was the model for the federal student loan program. But these are two completely different things that you're trying to have an insurance, a federal financial product on. A bank can repossess a house. In fact, they do. And so we'll see what happens with the end of the eviction moratorium in terms of with the landlords and things like that. That is fundamentally the case about that case. But I think a better comparison actually to think about this is actually understanding the crisis that is going to happen with education is that the two great things that the New Dealers failed to push for or failed to get is some kind of federal higher education program, as well as some kind of federal health program, eds and meds. And eds and meds are intimately intertwined, and they are both reliant in this country on two different financial products. And I think that that's a critical thing, that the very institutions upon which American education and American health are intertwined are being linked to these financial products. And I do think it's very important that we didn't have a real healthcare program coming out of the New Deal or a real higher education program coming out of the New Deal, though there was definitely a push at the time for it. With the question about the housing, I do think we do need to think about how expensive housing has become. I think you're right. There isn't a push for public housing in the same way, but there is some kind of question about some kind of intervention and some help. And also very striking for me that some of the ways that local governments and states have tried to experiment with dealing with this here in Illinois is an interesting program where to encourage people to buy homes, young people who can't afford it, maybe because of their student loans, that you can somehow, it's a very complicated program that you can fold your student loans into your mortgage in order to enable you to buy a house, trying to deal with the question of the crisis in young people, millennials and Gen Zs buying houses or not buying houses, and their student debt. So I do actually think there's some intertwine, but it's not the easy fix, because again, these are two very different financial products that we're actually talking about and two different institutions. And health insurance, the health question is an easier way to see the dependence on financial products as a part of American social welfare, not something recent in the 1970s.
Thank you. Next, we have from, I believe, the West Coast, Nelson Lichtenstein, if you would unmute yourself, and then following Catherine Jewell. So please just stand by. Nelson.
Okay, I think I did that.
Yes, you did.
Yes. Well, I have my question down there on the chat. So, was there a turning point that didn't turn since World War II? Was there any moment? What would be the moment, Ellie, that things might have turned out a little differently, gone in a different direction? Actually, could have been a worse direction as well as a better one. Or maybe even a more interesting way of asking that question is, who was the most sophisticated and progressive and well-known critic that was there? Was there a kind of alternative voice that was there, in Congress or out? And here before Occupy, in the 20th century. Any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. And thank you for the question. Turning points, I do think it's really important that the New Dealers start the path of we're going to provide this aid for expanding higher education. There was actually a hope of making work study permanent, a permanent program before it was summarily killed in 43, that if that had not been the choice, I think that that would have been very powerful, or a real federal investment in public college universities to have the public competitor that things like the Tennessee Valley Authority, what actually was. Similarly with the GI Bill, it's incredible to imagine. This might still have put it tuition assistance. It would have been incredible to imagine that the GI Bill would have been run. I think it would definitely would have been rendered under the Federal Security Administration, and you could just see how easily that could have been extended to the citizenry, and that is a very powerful argument for it. In terms of the chief critics of the loan program, you yourself might know someone. So one of the most vocal would be the University of California President Clark Kerr, who said that these loan programs are going to be turning public goods into private luxuries. And he damned not just those in Washington who was actually supposed to be helping, is actually supposed to be on the task force doing this, but also Nelson Rockefeller himself in terms of how he was expanding SUNY. But I need to point out that Claiborne Pell himself actually was deeply concerned about this, the loan program, particularly after the 72 reauthorization, and had these dreams of could we someday actually get rid of it. So I think that there are these people who are concerned about it, much less the students themselves and what they say in the early 90s when they have a chance to first take the floor of Congress and talk about what it was like to try and pay for education.
Thank you. Michael Goodman, your hand is up. Please unmute and pose a question.
Yeah, thanks. These would be my questions. First of all, an observation that the other great opportunity that was lost during the New Deal was for a national health care coverage. I think that was thanks to the influence of the AMA lobby and others that ruined that prospect as being part of the New Deal. My other question is this, regarding the availability of the loan money for education. To what extent do you think that has served to drive up both academic salaries and expenditures on administrators, and also to drive up tuition? The fact that there's this large pool of money that's available now that wasn't there in previous decades. Thanks.
Those are two great questions. The AMA point to fighting some kind of healthcare program in the United States is really important. Just as similarly that you have a lot of academics who are opposed and fearful actually of federal control of higher education throughout the 30s and the 40s, actually into the 50s for sure. In terms of the question of having federal student loans driving up costs, actually I have a great quote in the book where literally a policymaker lays out is that because there is not a mandate for how much or some kind of percentage about how much states have to spend on higher education. The quote is that legislators just know that they can make those education cuts because college universities can just make up with tuition, i.e. the students can just borrow more. And it is right out there that is very clear. In terms of actually what the money is for, the thing that I'm cautious about with admin, and I know we know all of these stories, they're the frequent sort of fodder, is, it is actually expensive to run an institution of higher education. Like it's as simple as like making sure that you're keeping up with the most standard computers, internet, things like that, with administrative costs. Actually, the strange thing is that if you actually have to have a development office looking for grants, looking for donations, that's more administrative costs, as is actually having a financial aid office. It's really the Sputnik legislation, the National Education Act legislation that actually makes financial aid officers found throughout campuses across the country where they hadn't been before. And so there's a strange way actually that just keeping the business of education going requires a lot of administrative costs, but there's also some salary cutting in there, is in terms of actually sort of how someone is tagged about how much you can pay for them, their ability to unionize if there's a faculty union, all of these different kinds of questions. And to be honest, I actually think less of the salaries for faculty going up actually in the pressure since the 70s with the Great Depression in higher education, the next Great Depression in higher education, as it was called at the time, which continues to this day, but actually the increasing reliant on contingent labor. And also, of course, of graduate students doing that as well. So I think we need to be very cautious about the complicated finances of keeping a campus running and able to deal with, for example, COVID-19 and just the crash, just the destructive capabilities it took on university budgets and college budgets across the country. But thank you for the question.
Catherine Jewell's hand is up. Please unmute.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Hi, Ellie. So I have a question about that COVID crisis moment that we find ourselves in, coupled with what we have heard a lot of talk about the coming demographic cliff that a lot of universities are facing, with just the number of 18-year-olds dropping for the foreseeable future. And so I guess I'm looking, to the next 1, 2, 3 years and how we might use this conversation and your research to frame some of those questions about what we do in the face of this, what we're told is this impending crisis, especially with the federal funds that a lot of institutions have still in their coffers from COVID, but facing these budget deficits that are coming, especially at public colleges like the one that I work at. What can we learn from your research about?
You cut off, or you, okay.
Sorry, yeah, that was my computer.
Oh, okay, good. And a point of clarification, Kate and I know each other outside of this webinar context. That is such a fantastic question, because I do think that the COVID crisis just heightened mainstream awareness about the challenge of college financing, and also awareness of this demographic cliff, because we had during the Great Recession birth rates that we hadn't seen since the Great Depression. And this is just as Professor Thelin was talking about, that was also something that was facing at the end of that baby boom generation, was also very terrifying for college administrators back in the 70s. For sure. And I think it is a larger question about recognizing the importance of colleges and universities. Part of that, I think, in terms of thinking about this reframing, is recognizing the many uses of the university that are so entwined, and that actually emphasizing that this needs some kind of, that we need a real public investment on this, and actually a public investment that makes it possible to actually go to college and continue your education at different points in your life, and the actual value to that. So it can't just be a value of the degrees learned for the wages potentially earned, but actually that this is actually something that is nourishing and important, actually, both to this democracy. And that was the big takeaway of that Sook report, and also the great lesson of both the GI Bill and the work study, but also for just what has gotten us through COVID-19 are actually the arts and humanities, not just the social scientists explaining us how to best roll out vaccines, not just the scientists actually developing the vaccines, but a larger question about the fundamental place of a college and university and the importance of education to a democracy. And here I'm actually sounding a little bit like the Jeffersonian I never was at UVA. And I think that is this COVID-19 and the coming conversation about what we're facing is a great example of recognizing the important place of college universities. There was a spike in college closures around the passage of the Higher Education Act, and the loss of a college and university is devastating. Either here in Chicago, if we actually lost a Chicago State, that would be devastating for the South Side of Chicago. And that was one of the things we were facing during a budget showdown here in Illinois, but also to a small town. What would it be like? And Kate Jewell teaches at Fitchburg State. It would be devastating, actually, to Western Mass to lose Fitchburg State on a variety of levels. And we need a fundamental recognition about how integrated college and universities are in the fabric of American life and why they deserve better support.
Thank you. Firdaus Intaj, your hand is up, unmute, and you can pose a question. Welcome. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for this wonderful conversation, and I learned a lot from Dr. Shermer. So over the years, the student loan effort has been tried to control or mediated by the federal government by different presidents over the years. And there have been some problems, like there was Great Depression, building cost increase, housing cost increase. But there have been dropouts, like in the undergrads and some of the grad students also. So how does this student loan phenomenon affects the students dropping out from the college and universities, and how does this affect students choosing they want to go for higher education? Because if someone finished their undergrads and they have huge student debt, they would not choose going for higher education. They will take jobs at any cost for the temporary benefits. So has there been any effort from the government, like they have a target workforce they need with college education or higher education, so they can influence the student enrollment in the college and universities? Because if students are more influenced or like appreciated for their studying, like with the merit-based scholarship or like funding from the government, I think the student debt scenario could have been like more reduced. So to sum up, my question is: was there any target workforce dependent on the student loan debt rate, so the government can achieve their purpose?
Thank you for your questions. It was great. And I think one of the things I want to, there's a couple of things to focus on there. And I'm going to talk about the dropout rate. Actually, the answer word for is the college completion rate. And we do know actually that the debt, or also both the food and housing insecurities, that at least a third of college students were affected by before the pandemic. That's before the pandemic. And it's the Hope Center out of Temple, which has the most recent research on how this has been during the pandemic, has pushed students to drop out. This actually exacerbates the issue of the debts incurred, because the likelihood of being able to compete, you wouldn't be able to compete for the job that might help you pay back your loans. But I really appreciate that question right now in the midst of the COVID crisis that Kate Jewell actually brought into our discussion, because there's been a broad discussion actually about we need folks who are doing jobs that are more vocational in nature, and that's actually someone else's word, the vocational in nature, that there's a push to go to college and taking, instead of looking for those vocational things, and a lot of conversations about the internships and the on-the-job training that is available through certain things, also the credentials and programs as well. And I think the interesting thing about that is also people don't realize that the student debt question is actually interwoven and actually going to more trade schools or vocational schools or those kinds of things as well, in terms of a limit, and actually limiting the United States from having the workforce that it needs, both to survive domestically, but also to compete globally. And I think it needs a broader reassessment about what the country needs, both nationally, both at home, but also to be globally competitive, and how best to support that. And that means not just supporting the research universities, which were the benefactors of the R&D that Professor Thelin talked about is really sort of holding sway in the 40s and 50s, but also actually supporting the community colleges and the vocational schools that are so important as well, in terms of actually providing the workforce training that is a public good, because we need these folks to be a functioning society, and they should not be encumbered with debts impossible to pay off, for getting the skills needed for, I think we're now finally at a moment in the context of COVID to really rethink that how many jobs are actually essential in a way that we haven't been before, and that we need to support the education necessary for that.
Thank you. Let me get a question in here before I go to the Q&A question that has been written in. And I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit more about proprietary schools, the roles that they've played historically, the roles that they play in the more recent present. You make a case in the book that these schools, while not necessarily cheap, do offer something to students in, let's say, the early 20th century who might not have been able to go to a four-year college. But in more recent decades, proprietary becomes predatory in many ways, and they play a somewhat outsized role in the crisis, that you described in recent decades. So if you could just expand a little bit about what you found with proprietary schools over the course of the 20th and early 21st century.
Absolutely. And I want to actually give a plug in then for a great historian by the name of Tina Groger, who sadly I don't believe on this phone call today, but she's phenomenal. And I draw a lot of the work actually on the early proprietary or for-profit schools from her important work as proprietary schools as a critical source of education for the many people unable to, being Americans of color, immigrants, women, having a chance to actually get the education that they want. And this was an important role for-profit schools. And I think another key part of that is actually recognizing that the distinctions that we want to make now between for-profit, nonprofit, state, and public, that's actually something that is really sort of solidified by the New Deal. And one of the things that Groger does in her excellent work is to show that the attacks on proprietary schools were actually from elite colleges and universities recognizing these proprietary schools as a threat on many different levels as well. But the interesting thing about proprietary schools is we've always had them. And even though I made an emphasis on how in 72 they have limited access to the federal student loan programs, they were always a point of access for GIs. And there's a really interesting aspect of that. And it was something, these were colleges and universities, these for-profit institutions, which were allowed to be a part of the successive GI bills, and actually in the original one as well. And they happened to serve a role, but where they really exploded is with the technologies of the internet. And I think that this is something that all of us need to think about now, those of us who in nonprofit institutions, whether public or private, facing the fact that it is the proprietary schools that really had doubled down on the potential of technology and use of it. And I think there's absolutely compelling case, as evidenced by the prosecutions of the federal government, of the many for-profit things that ended up in credentials that were meaningless, that were useless, but actually that there was a lesson that we could have learned earlier than this about the ways that we could have better reached students, which is why they were going for these online institutions as well. And that I think is a key sort of shifting point in terms of the use that they made of technologies that would have made higher education more accessible, especially since we did not have the explosion of community colleges that was laid out. What Professor Thelin talked about is the original Zook report about imagining many more community colleges across the country to give Americans that avenue into, which is not actually on the table with the current debate with the infrastructure bill. If we get community colleges, it's actually to bolster the ones that we have now instead of expanding those opportunities at the local level to give more access to higher education, both in person, which is invaluable, but perhaps also making use of the correct technologies.
Thank you. John, please.
To reinforce Ellie's point, take the University of Phoenix, which is so omnipresent in the era of internet enrollment, but its founding was actually very different. It was founded by a history professor from San Jose State who was upset at the lack of access that even the California public higher education system provided for part-time students, for returning students, for mothers, for military. And it was essentially like storefronts. And they'd set up classes on military bases. And I think what happened in the early and mid 70s is that the established nonprofit colleges and universities did not take them seriously. They also underserved many of these constituencies. And so this would morph into a very different situation with internet instruction. But the established colleges, I think in some ways were asleep at the wheel.
Thank you. Brian Alexander writes a note in the chat, looking ahead to the impact of the climate crisis. What can we learn from the past century of higher education? Should we expect a Sputnik moment for the Anthropocene? Will a Congress think to boost student enrollment in order to produce a cadre of graduates ready to work on the problem? Or will the feds and state governments, financially hit by climate issues, cut funds to higher education, public higher education? A simple question.
Oh, and I think the question is, again, since we just came off another threatened government shutdown, and we'll see what happens in December. Oh, and there's also that the potential of defaulting on the debt in the middle of October. We are dealing with a battleground at the federal government that I'm very proud this book shows has been there for since the New Deal, actually before it. And I think that that's important, is about why it might actually by default go to state and local governments as well. But the interesting thing is, I'm actually not sure it's going to be the climate crisis that does it. I actually think it's going to be more likely health. And I think it's because of COVID that you can actually see that. And again, there is a great question. Can you separate the COVID crisis from the climate crisis? And I don't actually think that you can. I think they're deeply intertwined. If the stories, the work done to say that it was a crossover because of the how close the area was to where that caves were. Look, I'm not a public health person, but those stories about that sort of animal to human crossover with the wet markets, is that a case of it? But I think you're more likely to see that. And if that is what happens, I do think it might actually be, unless there's a serious intervention, a doubling down actually on the use of the financial products to do that, in terms of that trust about eds and meds can be sustained through health insurance, through some kind of student assistance programs, unless we have a serious intervention otherwise. Now, granted, there's pushes for it right now, but I think that that is actually more likely to trigger it to have that Sputnik moment. So maybe 10, 15, 20 years from now, we're going to think as COVID as our Sputnik moment, and sort of building off actually of how important health had already become. I think you could argue like the DNA, biometric data, but the biology that was already a driver of the new 21st century commodity was either data or our biological matter itself. That's what I think might actually be our Sputnik moment, intertwined with the climate crisis.
Thank you. Let me return to an issue that you've addressed, but I want to push you and see if you could expand on this a little bit. And it's the issue of the moment in which student debt becomes an actual political issue, in which student voices are heard at long last, and why those voices weren't heard, or even the critique wasn't even being put forward. So Students for a Democratic Society has a critique of higher education. This isn't a prominent part of it. Mm-hmm. And so the question is it simply that students are just preoccupied with other political issues, or is it that the matter of drowning in college debt is less severe earlier and becomes more severe in the 1970s and 80s? You talk about what happens in the 1970s economically with stagflation and the kind of the drying up of the job market. Is that the moment, kind of a tipping point of sorts, where the debt issue just simply intensifies? But even then, there's a lag in this becoming a political issue. And I'm still just trying to understand why this hasn't animated more people more intensely earlier.
I think the interesting thing from my perspective of it is that I did hear them. I heard them in the archives in what Nixon administration appointees called grief mail. Yes. And there is something about this shame with this debt, this blaming on yourselves that we have incurred this, and that students and parents before the 65 higher education trying to find ways to pay, but their private blame and shame that they were not living the American dream, they would tell to their elected representatives who did or did not choose to hear it or actually engage with it. And I do also have to say, in the context of SDS, a lot of those student radicals, especially if they may not have been coming from families making less than middle income, less than that $5,600 a year, in terms of we thinking about the demographics of a largely white SDS. And so when you have an expansion of actually who is going to college, coupled with that wage stagnation, as well as the growing inequality, I think it does lead to a tipping point. And I think that is why I do think that Occupy was not given as much credit as it deserves about taking this conversation about the many debts that Americans incur in order to actually just survive, whether it be health, because that was also a major topic in the debt in the Occupy movement as well. The health debt that was done. In fact, the early campaigns were actually about buying up toxic health debt and then moving to student debt, that it was actually that moment to talk about a shared American experience of the debt that they were drowning in. And I think it also doesn't help that I show it in the book, they didn't actually start separating household debt from nonprofit debt until the turn of the millennium. So we don't have good data before 2000 on this. And then they didn't even start aggregating the debt between household, health, credit cards until the early 2000s. And so there's this way that we don't have a good look at the kind of debt that people are incurring. And more importantly, that we don't have good data also on the bankruptcy issue as well, that it would be brought up, but it wasn't actually the kind of the bankruptcies from student debt. The bankruptcies from student debt weren't being brought up, or the inability to pay were not being brought up. It would come up occasionally in congressional inquiries into it, but the story actually in a lot of the Office of Education, then the Department of Education, is terrible records on this stuff. And if you think about it, it's a financial product upon which it is hard to keep good records. It is a loan done from a bank. And I think the issue is it's a perfect storm of a strange American tendency to blame your individual self for not making it, and not having the venues, as we're becoming more and more cocooned in our suburbs to talk about it, not being listened to when you actually write, policymakers not inviting you to the table until the early 90s to ask you. And then it is only this collective discussion of the debts and the weights incurring that has led to a more energetic charge of it. I also do think that the more white middle class families are finding themselves in debt, the more attention is paid, period, which is something that we could say is another truism of American politics.
Indeed. Let me go back to the question of a new deal for education, or the absence of a new deal for education, and a point that you did raise, which is the hesitancy or opposition that university administrators have to any variety of government assistance. Can you talk about that? So they fear control over their affairs, but no one is threatening or promising to control their affairs. So is this just a kind of residual conservative mindset that prevents them from seeing their own and their own students' financial interests? Or what's going on in their minds, A, and B, how and when do they decisively change their minds about this and say, never mind, we'll take the money? Unmute.
I just said take the money and run. I do think, and that's actually one of my favorite things about all the story, all the celebratory stories of FDR's brain stress or brain trust, depending on how people felt like talking about it at the time, is that there was a lot of elite academic opposition. And this is really sort of grounded in this fear of federal control of higher education. And the question is, where I will be sympathetic to them, there is actually quite the experimentation with rebalancing federal power. And they are actually looking at what is happening in Europe and wondering. And so their worst guesses, their worst possibilities. I also think that the importance of the New Deal actually making an attempt to empower working class people, that there is also that fear that there's a class, there's a racial, there's an ethnic, there's a xenophobia going on in there in terms of these academic fears. And I think you can really hear that with Robert Hutchins, usually credited as one of the great civil libertarians of the mid-20th century. And that academic fear, and the question though is like, when they actually get a work-study program that gives them incredible control over the program, why is that not enough? And the answer is it's great for some. And it starts to change some academics' minds about federal control, or excuse me, about federal aid to education. It starts to, and it is a slow process, very similar with the GI Bill as well. But it is a very slow process. And I really think that actually, even though Harvard's Conant will shift, he's actually opposed to what he called a crash program coming out of the Sputnik satellite crisis. He will shift by the time you get to the early 60s. I actually think it's a generational shift. I do think it's a generation of post-war academics, at the helm of it being Clark Kerr, reimagining and creating a new American ideal for the public research university, which, by the way, he always said, if someone actually bothers to read, uses of the university is going to rely on a lot of private money like the UC did even under his reign, that what you fundamentally are dealing with is a new generation that is actually reimagining the possibilities after seeing 20 years of federal tuition assistance that did not actually come with the federal control that they were fearful of. And I think that that's a fundamental importance, and also a great reminder in terms of reassessing the New Deal, that businesses' fear of federal control never came to what they thought it would. And that's some of the great opponents of the New Deal created this bogeyman, which never actually looked like what the New Deal actually did, but unfortunately has gotten stuck in our textbooks, when we really need to have a real reassessment about how much federal power and federal oversight the New Deal is doing on critical programs for social welfare, including education.
Thank you. Let me combine two questions in the Q&A. Maria Shin says, thank God for this book. She works on racial segregation in education and is concerned about its connection to the housing crisis. And she wants you to talk a little bit more about that intersection. Since we've had a housing financial crisis, what do you foresee happening in an education crisis? And Steve Lipsum asks, can you talk about student loan forgiveness programs, the history behind them, and whatever implications you want to draw regarding their history or effects?
Okay, so much there. Let me actually talk about the forgiveness, because that's actually what I see coming. I have actually been waited with bated breath, because there's allegedly changes coming to the public service loan forgiveness program, new rulemaking. The way that I always joke when I talk about PSLF is that you have to understand it coming out of a Congress which didn't actually want you to actually pay off your loan, or assuming that someone else would pay off your loan. They're going to find a way with the rules in it to get you to pay off your loan. But there's an interesting new conversations about the rulemaking power of the education department, trying to actually make it possible to actually get their forgiveness promised in the title of it. We shall see what happens, which is how my words are anything coming out of Washington. Let's just see how this goes. And I think the thing that's challenging for me about PSLF is that there were efforts about making forgiveness possible from the very start of these loan experiments. I didn't talk about it, but there's actually a little loan program after the end of work study to help those still in college finish their degrees so they could actually go work in the ward during the war as a doctor or a nurse, that they actually needed them to finish it. And so that was actually forgiven. If you did your military service as you were supposed to do. Similar, there's a promise with what I call the Sputnik loans, the defense education loans, that you're going to have some forgiveness working as a public school teacher, things like that. Hostility to that. The idea being that, no, people need to pay what they owe. And I think that that's a fundamental feature of any time that there's been discussion of different kinds of forgiveness and the challenges of implementing the forgiveness program, especially as the administrations have changed. And that is particularly true of the last administration, headed by someone whose families have deep ties to the student loan program. So my question then is, if there's going to be real rule changes, get it done now, because we don't know what the next administration is going to be and when. That relates to the question of what do I foresee with the housing and education crisis. There's incredible momentum right now for student debt forgiveness, but when I listen to the Biden administration education secretary saying it ain't going to happen, I hear progressive Democrats keep putting the pressure on Biden to do an executive order. But the education department saying no, but not the president, and a president who on the campaign trail had said that he wanted, and actually even after, wanted Congress to do it. I don't see any discussion of that coming out of Congress, but I do see congressional progressive continuing to put the pressure on an executive order. I don't know what's going to happen between now and January 31st when the next moratorium is set to end. It doesn't look promising unless you keep screaming. And then I would also say we have no idea what is going to come out of this infrastructure bill. I think there's some interesting things. It is not the really incredible College for All Act, which would do a lot, and I think is really exciting, that is being pushed for. However, among progressive circles. However, what I do think is interesting about the infrastructure bill, free community college, that's interesting. You got to be careful about it because it requires, like Obamacare, and again, eds and meds, you can't separate them. It requires, like the Obamacare, to have states put in with that. Will we have more states put in with that than the Medicare expansion under Obamacare or setting up the exchanges? I don't know. It's interesting because Tennessee was one of the first states to experiment with free community college. That's a red state. That's Mitch McConnell. But that was also more than a decade ago. Or yeah, it's less than a decade ago. So I just don't know. But it is interesting because what it could do is have the cost of community college, and you would have a public competitor. It's actually reaching back to that original Zook report. You would have a public competitor for the first 2 years of college. What would that do in terms of putting pressure in terms of the cost of higher education at other four-year institutions, whether it's public universities or private universities? The answer is I don't know. But it's interesting. And I think we're at a really interesting moment when there's a push and a desire and a recognition. I am not sure what's going to come out of it, particularly in Washington, but I do think there's encouraging, interesting things happening at the state level. So we shall see what happens. And I know that's not the greatest point to end on, but I think it's very similar too, in terms of, I'm glad that you saw the link between the housing and ed, because folks in the Department of Ed have also read my book, and their first question is like, it sounds a lot like redlining. And I was like, yes. And what will that mean in terms of opening up the possibilities? I don't know. I just know they've read my book and are interested in what they can take from it in terms of dealing with this the student debt crisis, which has racial, gender, and economic implications.
Historians don't usually do predictions or do them very well, but I think you've laid out very nicely the issues that we will be looking at in the weeks, months, and years ahead. And with that, unfortunately, we have to draw this to a close. I want to thank Elizabeth Shermer, John Thelin, and of course, Christian Osterman for this terrific session. And with that, I turn it back to Christian for final words. Sir.
Well, thank you, Eric. Just my thanks as well to Ellie, John, and of course you, Eric, for this really rich and riveting conversation. Thanks to our audience for participating, for your questions. Again, this coming Monday, we'll focus on a new book edited by Mark Bradley and Mary Dudziak on Making the Forever War, Marilyn Young and the Culture and Politics of American Militarism. We're adjourned. Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening. Stay safe.